The federal government appoints an external administrator to clean out the CFMEU. Australia's ambassador to the US, Kevin Rudd, says people should chill about the prospect of a Trump White House. And super funds record a second successive boom year for members. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It's Thursday, the 18th of July, 2024. I'm Julian King, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Julian.
Sean, the main story this morning, the federal government has appointed an external administrator to clean out the CFMEU, and Workplace Relations Minister Tony Burke has warned the government will legislate to remove any legal barriers if opposed by the union.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the divisions in Victoria, which is the centre of allegations involving thuggery and organised crime, as well as Queensland, New South Wales and by extension South Australia and Tasmania, will be placed under administration. Labor's National Executive agreed to requests from all eastern states' Labor governments, except the ACT, to suspend the CFMEU Construction and General Division's affiliation with the Labor Party and stop donations and affiliation fees. Now, the Federal Labor Party will also sever all ties while the union is under administration, although it won't be handing back donations it's received from the CFMEU. The peak union body, the ACTU, said it will suspend the CFMEU as an affiliate. Opposition leader Peter Dutton said the action isn't enough and the union should be deregistered. He said the CFMEU's thuggish behaviour will turn out to be the biggest defrauding of the Australian taxpayer in history.
Yeah, there's so much in this story. So what do we know so far? Or maybe it's better put as what has been alleged by the Nine Media investigation.
Yeah, it's a good point. These are allegations untested in court. The investigation has alleged that bikies, criminals and underworld figures had infiltrated the building industry, some of whom are employed on federal and state government-funded projects. It's alleged that senior officials of the CFMEU took bribes, and there were hundreds of thousands of dollars in free building work being given out by major builders to union bosses. There's also been claims of CFMEU officials threatening factional opponents at their homes. Victorian boss John Setka stepped down last Friday ahead of all these allegations. Complicating things, particularly for the government, is the role the union plays in hundreds of major construction projects across the country and the union's close ties to the federal and state Labor parties, with some members working at the union before being elected to Parliament. This is a story that will go on for weeks and weeks, possibly months. The CFMEU leadership has called for politicians to effectively to butt out, really, let them look after their own problems. That ain't going to happen.
No, I don't think so. Plenty more water still to go under the bridge. How did local markets perform yesterday?
Another great day. The S&P ASX 200 closed up 0.7% to a new closing high of 8,058 points. It followed strong gains on Wall Street. About 80% of the top 200 stocks finished higher yesterday with strong performances from Macquarie Group, which was up more than 2%, as well as Telstra, Woolies and National Australia Bank. James Hardie jumped more than 6%, building on gains earlier in the week. Now, Hardy's is very exposed to the US economy and lower rates should help earnings at the building products group. Gold stocks did well as the price of the precious metal rose. West African Resources and Bellevue Gold were both higher. Property stocks continued their recent good run with Goodman, Centre and Charter Hall showing the way. Now, property companies are highly leveraged, plenty of debt. So if interest rates fall, then their earnings, well, it reduces their interest rate payments and their earnings should increase. Good for the sector. In fact, the REIT index, the Real Estate Investment Trust Index, is now up more than 7% over the past week. The tech stocks also did well, led by WiseTech. The big miners were the worst performers.
And what's happening in international markets?
Well, Wall Street just keeps running with the broad-based S&P 500 rising yesterday, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which measures 30 of the largest companies in the US, it hit a new record. Small caps are also doing well, not something we've been able to say too regularly in the past few years. The Russell 2000 has now risen for 5 straight days, its longest run since April 2000. The S&P 500 is up about 20% this year. Spurring on the bourse is confidence that rate cuts are coming in coming months and a growing belief that Donald Trump will win the November presidency poll. One of Mr. Trump's signature policies is to cut corporate taxes. That should bolster earnings. Hence, people like the share market. Gold's also on a tear, hitting a new peak of 2649.66 US dollars an ounce. US bond yields have fallen, reflecting expectations of lower interest rates. Bitcoin's higher, worth just under 66,000 US dollars a unit. And Julian, finally, the Aussie dollar is buying 67.3 US cents.
Yeah, it's on a 6-month high, the Australian dollar. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, says Australia is positioned well, regardless of whether the Democrats or the Republicans win the US presidential election in November.
Mr. Rudd, who of course is a former Prime Minister, said he had been assiduous in working to get acquainted with likely key figures in a potential future Trump administration. Speaking to another former ambassador and a former Federal Treasurer, Joe Hockey, Mr. Rudd said he'd been travelling the country getting to know people who get key positions in foreign policy, national security, trade, domestic policy, the economy and Treasury. He also said he'd been telling European counterparts to chill at the prospect of a repeat Trump White House, saying if elected, a Trump presidency would present a perfectly navigable and manageable set of relationships over the next 4 years. I wonder how the Europeans liked hearing Kevin Rudd telling them to chill.
They'd reply by saying, fair shake of the old sauce bottle, mate.
Yes, or something like that.
Or something like that. We miss Kevin 07.
We do.
Sean, mum and dad investors are cutting their holdings in the big four banks, taking the level of retail shareholder ownership to a record low.
Notwithstanding the bank shares soaring, with Commonwealth Bank hitting new records recently, retail investors were net sellers in the 3 months to the end of June, according to Jarden Australia. Commonwealth Bank, National Australia Bank and ANZ recorded their lowest level of retail ownership ever. Westpac's the exception, and Jarden explains that it's because of its higher franked dividend yield and the appeal of its recent special dividend. In a note to clients, Jarden also said overseas ownership of banks had continued to rise quarter on quarter, with ANZ recording the highest offshore ownership among the banks at 30%. Commonwealth Bank enjoyed its highest offshore ownership on record at 23.8%. Basically, retail investors are getting out, offshore investors are getting in. Local institutional investors, think the big super funds, they're still buying their banks, with the National Australia Bank the favourite among the big four, with its domestic institutional ownership at a 13-year high. In contrast, Westpac has the least share of domestic institutional ownership at 26.2%.
Yeah, the banks have been doing the heavy lifting, which drove up the price of that ASX 200. Do you think CBA is overpriced, Sean?
Everyone else thinks CBA is overpriced, and it keeps running. Certainly on historical valuations, it's very, very expensive. But been saying that for a few months now, and it just keeps going.
It does. A small super fund for the mining industry and major retail funds CFS First Choice and IOOF Balanced Investor Trusts were the top performers among growth funds last financial year, with the median fund returning 9.1%.
It was the second consecutive 9% plus year for super funds, as international equities underpinned strong returns, according to Chant West. The returns were well above the typical long-term objective of growth funds. Now, they're normally about 6%. The median growth fund was 9.1%. It's also the 13th positive outcome in the past 15 years. For the 12 months, it was a mix of retail and super funds that did best, while in terms of asset allocation, international equities by far outstripped local shares. The only asset class to provide negative returns last financial year was actually unlisted property. Growth funds have between 61 and 80% of their money in growth assets. The median for high growth funds was nearly 12%. Super is a long-term investment, and the best performing funds over 10 years, they do remain the industry funds led by Host Plus, Australian Retirement Trust and Aussie Super.
You mentioned there Chant West. Mano Mohan Kumar, Sean, is the Senior Investment Research Manager at Chant West, and immediately after this show, you've got a good chat with him.
Yes, we have a chat about how the different asset classes performed during the 2024 financial year. We also ask Mano what he thinks is going to happen in the coming 12 months or so. It's a great chat for any investor, anyone with a super fund, really.
Yep, stay tuned for that. Really interesting insights. Now, Australia has quietly become a food superpower, Sean, over the past decade, as local farmers have increased their output by more than 90%, according to billionaire paper, packaging and recycling magnate Anthony Pratt.
The Australian food production industry now represents 6% of Australia's gross domestic product, he said. Over the past 10 years, 1,200 food factories have been built across the nation, and food exports have more than doubled from $29 billion to $59 billion, he told the Australians Global Food Forum. Notably, beef exports to China over the period have grown by 200%. Mr. Pratt highlighted that Australia has secured 11 new free trade agreements in recent years, including the landmark Australia-India FTA that came into effect at the end of 2022. In total, we now have 18 FTAs in place. This has helped diversify the nation's food export, which is a good thing.
I vividly recall, Sean, the great kale shortage here in Australia of 2014. I'm sure that's a time you remember well.
Well, look, the one I remember is the great iceberg lettuce shortage when we ended up having, I think it was KFC, putting cabbage
That's right.
instead of iceberg lettuce in their burgers. A crisis.
Yes, and then the bananas. Don't forget the bananas.
That was a big one where they went up to about $10 a kilo. And when you went to someone's house and they had bananas, you thought they're rich.
BHP sold record amounts of Australian iron ore over the past year, but copper is where growth is likely to come from this year, Sean.
Copper production was 9% higher over the past year thanks to the Oz Minerals acquisition. It's forecast to rise by as much as 10% in the year ahead. BHP said its Escondida mine in Chile will begin producing high-grade material soon. BHP's been focused on building its copper assets, as demonstrated by its failed attempt to buy Anglo American earlier in the year. Demand for copper is expected to surge alongside electrification. Now, BHP sold 287.7 million tonnes, very hard to get your head around something of that size, 287.7 million tonnes of Australian iron ore last financial year, an increase of 3% and well ahead of the previous record set back in 2022. BHP's share price, though, fell nearly 1% yesterday. It's off 15% this year.
To international news now, the Republican National Convention continues in Milwaukee with a show of unity that contrasts sharply with division in the Democrats over Joe Biden staying in the campaign.
Former rivals of Mr. Trump, including his final challenger in the primaries, Nikki Haley, they spoke for the former president. Another one-time rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, also spoke for Mr. Trump. Interesting people turned up, including Rupert Murdoch. Mr. Trump is due to address the gathering tonight. Outside the convention, Ohio police officers shot and killed a man who was wielding two knives near the centre. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden is continuing his call to calm the divisive rhetoric on both sides. But that didn't stop him from listing why the former Trump administration was hell, that was his word, hell for Black Americans, including the former president's mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic, skyrocketing unemployment amid early lockdowns, and attempts to, as Biden put it, erase Black history.
For all the calling of the cooling of the political climate, I don't think it's going to be long before the temperature rises again there, Sean, in the USA. Yeah. Now, investment banking is back with Wall Street posting its best quarter for the sector in more than 2 years in what bankers said was the early innings of a sustained recovery.
The five largest investment banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America and Citigroup, together reported investment banking fees of more than $8 billion in the second quarter, a 40% increase from a year earlier and the highest since the start of 2022. All the banks, except Goldman, announced higher than expected investment banking revenues for the quarter. Each of the big five investment banks has outperformed the benchmark S&P 500 index over the past 3 months.
Now, in a story that's about half a rung above nuptials at the births, deaths and marriages office, possibly the world's most extravagant wedding has just taken place, with the youngest son of Asia's richest man marrying his longtime girlfriend. And I've got to say, the guest list was impressive.
It was. The youngest son of Mukesh Ambani, his name is Anant Ambani, married Radhika Merchant at the Ambani-owned Geo World Convention Centre in Mumbai. Now, we talked about this on Fear and Greed just a little while ago. The marriage culminated months of wedding events that featured performances by pop stars, including Rihanna and Justin Bieber. The guest list for the 4-day wedding that ran over last weekend included former British Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Boris Johnson, Saudi Aramco Chief Executive Ayman Nasser, Adele, the singer, staying with the singers, Lana Del Rey, Drake was there, David Beckham was there. Now, television news channels showed celebrities like Kim Kardashian in a red ensemble and professional wrestler and Hollywood actor John Cena. Kardashian sisters Kim and Khloe were there. They took a ride in a motorised rickshaw through Mumbai before joining the wedding ceremonies. I didn't get an invite. Julian, I presume you didn't.
It must have got lost in the mail. The question I'll ask you, Sean, is what do you get as a wedding gift for the richest man in Asia?
Yeah, I have absolutely no idea.
You can just imagine how much they gather in the wishing well by the end of the night.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Wow, incredible.
It is. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Mano Mohan Kumar, Senior Investment Research Manager at Chant West.
Yeah, it's all about the super returns for last year. It's a great chat about the different asset classes, which ones did well and which ones didn't do so well.
That is up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Julian.
It's Thursday, the 18th of July, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online at LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok, and Facebook. Have a great day.